All right, so the pre-scene was out yesterday, being Tuesday, the 25th of August. So I've been looking at it all yesterday, and it's a theme park called Hasper World in a country called Dealand, which is pretty funny for me with a surname like Freeland. Now, two things before we do start. The page which I'm going to be doing this analysis for is my own reading of the published pre-scene. Of course, it's independent. It's not affiliated with the ACCA, and I'm not going to predict what's going to be in the exam. And I'm also not going to read the pre-scene to you, as you've got your own copy and you've already read it by now. What I'm going to do is go through my analysis section by section, and I'll explain what I saw, what jumped out to me, and what I thought was significant. Now, the pre-scene mornings, every quarter, are one of my favorite mornings of the quarter and of the year, because we get a whole new industry to go and learn. And as a kid, I went to Disneyland a few times, so a theme park was always going to get my full interest and my full attention. So I'm very excited for this one. So as I said, I spent all of Tuesday on this, and this is what came out in terms of my read. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with how to read the document. Okay, so there's two rules really. Anchoring, so every claim on the page names a part of the pre-scene which it came from. And the staffing section states that. So the risk report lists that, not declaration. It's how I try to stop myself from drifting into things that the case never said. And it's how you can essentially check that what I'm telling you is relatable. So the second rule is that, as you know, you can't take your analysed or pre-scene into the exam. You got a clean copy on the exam software. So it isn't really just remembering it. It's about knowing the business well enough to find the things that are applicable fast and to know what they mean when the exhibit may present them. So one more thing here. We have on our contents, and this is on Exhibit A, the pre-scene. This is completely free. If you do want to look at it, the link will be in the comments. There's also a chat bot here, which is programmed on the pre-scene, and my method library. If you do want to have a conversation with A, you're absolutely welcome to it. So on the contents, we have B down to G, which is going to describe business, and then H to K is where my thinking is. So if you're short of time, try to build a picture from B to G, and then try and put your effort into H and K when you have a bit more of an idea. Right, we'll start with the industry context, which is part B. Right, so the industry opens up by separating an amusement park from a theme park, which is worth a moment, because an amusement park is a collection of rides where a theme park puts the rides inside a story. Operators moved that way because visitors stayed longer and more types of visitors came. So theming is a commercial decision here. It's not just there for decoration. So the market is all about $1 billion a year, 3 big parks holding 65% of it between them. And Hasper World is the smallest of the 3 of those 16. So nobody is dominating, which means that a position is actually contestable. Then we have a chart. All right, so where does the industry's money actually come from over 5 years? So tickets went from 66% of revenue down to about 58%. Food and drink stayed flat. Hotels went from 3% down to 12%. So nothing else in the industry. So half of the document moves that far. And because component D will put it against what Hasper World chose to do. Then we have 4 pressures, which is the economy, because a downturn hits visitor numbers straight away. Safety, where costs rise as parks compete on bigger rides. Weather, because Dealand has heavy rain. And sustainability, where 53% of visitors in a recent industry report said that it shapes which attractions that they do pick. There's also a bracket in the safety paragraph that I nearly skipped on first read. It says the latest industry statistics put the chance of a serious injury on a ride as extremely low. That changes the shape of the risk. It's less about probability and more about what one event does to confidence and to the license. Then there's a list I'd read as a benchmark. The development section describes what leading parks are doing. Apps with live queue times, wristbands that track where customers are, on-site hotels with pools and spas, virtual reality inside the rides. So keep that, because we'll set Hasper World's own systems against it. And then there's one more list right at the end of B. And in that, the industry measures itself on 5 things: revenue per visitor, visitor numbers, attendance growth, safety incident rate, net promoter score. So write those down, because I'm going to ask you to count them a little bit later. Component C is the table. So we have here a number of facts, 14 in total. So every one of them is straight from the document. The ones that I'd hold is over 50 years. It started by 2 farming brothers, Henrik and Arthur Glenn, on their own land to teach local children the country's history and legends. It was the first theme park in D-Land, 2 square kilometers, 11 roller coasters, and one of them is the tallest and longest in the country, put in 4 years ago. There's no hotel, and it's the only privately owned family-run theme park in the whole country. So 2 things I'd take from the pros under the table is that the education purpose is why the place exists, and the family still call it their differentiator today. And the growth has all been on one site, ride by ride. There's no acquisition anywhere in the document. And the hotel, the document doesn't actually say explicitly that they can't have one, but it does say the board believes a hotel is out of line with what they are. That's a belief, which is stated as a belief, which could be a choice, which we're going to look at in more detail in component H and see how effective or how much sense that would make. Then we have a business model and operations. So component D is the operating model, and the first paragraph has the fact, which I want you to look at closely. Visitors pay at the gate. Under 5s are free with a paying adult. Once you're in, the rides are free. Food, drink, and shopping are extra. And every food outlet and every shop on that site is owned and operated by Hasper World, so it's not a concession. And every food is in the park, which is going to matter again in component H, because it's not obvious yet, but we'll explain why. So most visitors in the park come in for pre-booked tickets from their website or their app. There are family tickets, there are group tickets, there are school offers, and monthly and annual season tickets. So the pricing pulls demand forward and rewards those who come back. But what the document does not give you is a ticket price, so it doesn't say in any year, so you can see revenue per visitor rising, and you can't split it into price rises, mix, and spend it inside the park. So test that on the day. Maybe the exhibits will zoom in on it in more detail, but don't assume anything from here. All right, now the bit of component D, which I really like. So from November to February, it rains, and the big roller coasters, the water slides, and the drop rides are closed because rain affects their braking systems. The smaller rides, the flat rides, the dark rides, and the playgrounds will stay open. So if you look at what stays open, the industry section says flat rides are generally for riders aged 3 to 12, whilst playgrounds are for children too young for the big rides. So for 4 months a year, most of what's open is what the industry section says is built for small children. The document never explicitly puts those 2 facts together because it leaves them next to each other and will let you try to notice. We can't tell whether the visitor mix actually shifts in winter because there's no monthly split, which is a gap, and I've written it as a gap. 2 more things in D. There's a control center, 1 room that monitors the hardware and software of every ride, watches the CCTV, and talks to the ride operators about incidents and weather. So the document calls it critical in those exact words, and for the IT section. So Hasper World has a website, it has an app, social media, booking, publicity, and feedback. So if we go back to the industry list from component B, it talks about Q apps, wristbands, hotel room access from your phone, virtual reality, but the document doesn't say that Hasper World looked at those and said no. It just doesn't mention them. So an absence in a pre-scene isn't necessarily a decision, and it could be potentially something that's brought out into the exhibits. All right, people and culture, very important. So the workforce has two halves, just over 100 full-time equivalent staff and nearly 300 seasonal workers, which were taken on from March to October on contracts of 4 to 8 months. So nearly 300 against just over 100, and even that isn't a clean comparison because the 100 is full-time equivalents and the 300 is people, so it's a shape, and I've kind of left it there as that. So over 80% of the seasonal workers are between 18 and 25. Training is normally 1 or 2 days. Ride operators get more than that and have to pass tests, and the people who check your restraints are the ride assistants, and the document gives the assistants the shorter training. But what I couldn't find was how many seasonal workers come back the following year, and that's not given. But what the proportion of the ride operations are seasonal, or operators are seasonal rather than permanent, isn't given either. So either number would essentially change how you might read it, and I've kind of made a note there that neither of them is essentially there. Next, we have the website extracts. So this is the bit of the whole document which I actually like the most, and I only really picked up on it on my second read. So the 2 lines here, and the ones that jumped out at me in its exact words, is that the mission says to entertain, educate, excite, and bring joy to the people of and visitors to D-Land. Whilst the vision says to be a world leader in inspiring people through entertainment and fun. So if we look at them again, the word educate is in the mission, but it's not in the vision. So 2 farmers built this park to teach children their country's history. 50 years on, the statement of where the business is going doesn't actually mention teaching anyone anything. So I'm not sure that's deliberate because I don't know, but the document prints them one after the other and says nothing about it. But it could be the kind of thing with having seen before we actually look into the exam. So there's 4 values and safety is the first. So let's try and think about that. Next, we have the governance and oversight. So component F is about the share register, which we need to get right because we can get quite sloppy with this. The executive board members own 50% between them. Each founder keeps 10. The remaining 30 is with other family members who don't work in the business. 50, 10, 10, 30, which adds up to 100. And there's nothing which is unaccounted for there. So we have 6 board seats. We have Arthur Glenn. The founder is the chair and he's over 80. His son Claude is a managing director. We have Susan, we have Martha, we have Joe, and we have Leaf, who hold the finance operations. We then have HR and marketing. Every one of them is a Glenn, whilst every board seat has only ever been held by a Glenn. Then the thing that the document does, that's specific and recent. So at the last family council, the once a year meeting, some of the 30% said performance is slowing and the business might need some fresh ideas. All right, so 4 things which I wrote down, and I think they're quite interesting here, is there's an absence rather than the verdict. So the chair is a founder and a shareholder, and the managing director is the son. There are no non-executive directors, there's no audit committee, there's no internal audit function anywhere in the document of the pre-scene that's mentioned. Nobody is named to succeed a chair over 80, and the challenge to strategy came from the people with 30% and with 1 meeting a year. So the pre-scene doesn't say explicitly that they decided against any of it. It just isn't written down there. So that could be something of note coming into the exam. Next, we have the financial baseline. So what essentially isn't there? So if we have a look at the figures here, we have the numbers. When I have a look at this, I start every financial section, usually the same. So what is there and what isn't? So there's not actually any profit figure. There's no costs. There's no margin. There's no balance sheet. There's no cash. There's no gearing, which means that so far in the pre-scene, you can't really say anything about whether the business is profitable yet. If you write a sentence about margins in the exam, then from the pre-scene, it's essentially been invented. Probably something will come up in the exhibits. But what you've got is revenue and volume, which is very important. 6 charts, 5 years with no date labels. Everything which I'm about to look at is read off the grid lines, which is approximate. So yeah, that's what I can see from the financials. So if we look at revenue, it's up in every one of them of the 5 years, as you can see. About $122 million to about 146, whilst the visitors is up in every one of the 5 years, 2.47 million to 2.71. So far, business is doing fine, which we can see. But if we look at the next two charts, Hasper World's attendance growth starts at about 2.8% and drifts down to about 2.3%. Which is down in every single year. So the industry starts at about 5% and climbs to nearly 7% up in every single year. So the two lines, which are moving in opposite directions, is every year over the 5. So market share falls in all 5 years, 18.3% to 16%, which is the case pre-scene telling us something. It's growing and it's losing on the same time. It's got the same set of numbers which show that conflict. So if you do read the revenue and you just taken that, you may have missed the other figures besides it. So there's no cause which has actually been given, but that's something that we'll potentially come back to. But from what I see in the numbers, it's one of the most important things which I actually did pick out there. Right. So two sums, and I'm thinking about them here because they're different. So if we look at a number that you gave, so it said revenue per visitor, right, which is down here, in the first year reads about $49, so 10, which is off the chart. So divide 122 million by 2.47 million visitors, which will give 49.40, but the chart indicates that it's 49.10, which doesn't quite meet for me, which is fine because we're looking at bars here and there's no labels. But the lesson is that if you put 49.10 in an answer, as if it were handed to you in the pre-scene, you've essentially claimed the precision, which wasn't actually given. So if we try and read that as a shape, don't try and quote the actual decimal. And then second, they didn't give you a revenue rose about 25 million across a period, and it can only have come from 2 places. So a lot of students may look at this and think, okay, it's more people, or is it each pundit or person spending more? So the visitors rose by about 240,000 at $49 a head, which is about 12 million spent per head, which rose by about $4.90 across 2.5 million visitors, which is about 12 million. Okay, so half the growth is more people and the other half is each person being worth more. So that number isn't in the pre-scene, it's what I took from the charts, and it matters because the site is 2 square kilometers, which isn't actually getting any bigger. So for the theme park, they need to think about what a visitor spends is actually half what the park can move in terms of profitability. So if we look at the Net Promoter Score, Hasper World starts at about 58 and ends at about 56, so it barely moves. So the industry starts level and then ends at 60, so they start alongside the market and then finish 4 points behind it. The score didn't fall the benchmark walked kind of past them. So the line, which I mentioned earlier, is that I couldn't tell you the share loss is because there's no hotel, or the technology gap, or closing the big rides for 4 months. So every one of those sounds convincing, but the document says none of it. So it shows you the pattern, but it doesn't actually give a cause. So if we write the pattern and refuse the cause, and we say share has fallen in each of the 5 years whilst the market grew faster, that would be analysis, where a share has fallen because they have no hotel is something that isn't actually implied in the case. So the ACCA published the examiner's reports of June 26, which actually described that candidates writing prepared pre-seen material into the first task, which wasn't actually relevant. So we need to think about what's going to be asked. So an invented cause is how that really starts to manifest. So if you look at the last thing on G, we get our 5 industry measures, which are written down. So Hasper's World charts report revenue per visitor. We looked at the visitor numbers, attendance growth, and the promoter score. So the one that isn't there is actually the safety incident rate. So this could apply to maybe the balanced scorecard. So safety is the first value, which they do mention on their website, and it is the first category in their own risk report. And the one industry measure that they don't publish is actually the safety one. So nothing actually says that the park is unsafe, but the gap is between what they say matters and what they actually show. Right, so we're now on to the second part, which is going to be H until L. So this is where most of the rational thinking will come on the exam, right? And it's what happens most of the time. So attention is a place where two things the business genuinely wants to pull, or will generally pull against each other, and the pre-scene refuses to say which one will win, which makes it different from a problem and different from a weakness. So the shape is useful because on the day you may be handed a proposal which hasn't been seen, which could be a fact excuse me, about the company, which they can't really do much, and attention can, in this circumstance, be applied to that. So I've mentioned 6 of them, and what we'll do is we'll take them in order and we'll discuss. Okay, so tension 1. We have here stated that one family holds every seat, and the document will credit that. So 50 years of commitment built the place, and nobody outside is forcing short-term decisions on a business whose assets last decades. So on the other side, the capability in the room is bounded by 6 relatives. There's no independent voice, there's no committees, there's no named successor for a chair over 80. And when a challenge came, it came from the people with 30% and a single meeting a year. But what makes it a tension and not a criticism is that it's the same fact doing both jobs. The family holding every seat is a source of the commitment. It's also the reason that the concern raised that the family council has nowhere structurally to go. So the document of the pre-scene tells us that the concern was raised, but it doesn't tell us what the board actually did about it, which could be an interesting one. Next we have tension 2, which is the hotel, and what I told you to park earlier to look at. So the hotels went from 3% of industry revenue to 12 in 5 years. The fastest growing line in the sector is the one that this board decided not to enter, and it was a decision, it was a belief, which means it wasn't a constraint. So one side had running hotels as a different business with different capital and different risks. So a board that knows what it isn't is doing something that a lot of boards actually can't do, and they've grown revenue every year without one. So on a site, a hotel would kind of eat into. So the other side mentions that, which was mentioned in component D, they own every food outlet and every shop inside the park, so they already capture everything that a visitor spends from the moment they walk through the gate. which changes the question because they aren't missing out on food and drink. They own all of it already. But the question is rather whether a business that already owns the whole of the visitor's day should own the evening as well. So a visitor who stays 2 nights spends those 2 evenings somewhere. At the moment, it's going to be somewhere else. So the pre-scene shows the market's growth moving into a line, and they're not in line with it. So it doesn't say which is the better trade, which could be one of the options which might actually come up. Then we have tension free, which is where it's growing whilst losing market share. So tension free is the numbers we looked at earlier, which is argued in both ways. So we have growth is growth. It's the third biggest in a market of nearly $1 billion, revenue per visitor rising, and no year of decline in the whole period, which is not obviously, isn't a business which is in trouble. But on the contrary, share tells you whether growth was earned or just received in a market growing at 5 to 7% a year. So a park grows even if it does nothing. So growth that only comes from the market is not the same as competing. Then we have 5 straight years of share loss with the gap widening, which is a trend. And there's the limit. So there's no cost or profit data. So you cannot say whether Hasper World's slower growth is more or less profitable than the rivals. So faster growth is if they make more on each visitor, which could be growing slowly, might be the sensible choice rather than the failure that it looks like. But the evidence to settle that isn't actually in the pre-scene. Then we have tension 4, which is the innovation towards their expectations. So the fourth value on the website says that they aim to innovate towards visitors' expectations, their own risk report names, the risk in their own words, which is growth suffers if visitors find the attractions outdated. So on one side, they put in the tallest, longest roller coaster in the country, which was installed 4 years ago, which is their differentiator, being education, which isn't actually a technology proposition. And then chasing every new technology is a reliable way to spend money on things that go out of date. So on the other hand, technology adoption is one of the 3 main drivers of market growth. And on every capability the document describes the industry, so Hasper World's own disclosure is narrower. So the pre-scene never actually says they looked at wristbands and virtual reality and said no, but it doesn't explicitly say that their visitors do want them. So it puts the gap next to the risk and then leaves them there. We then have tension 5, which is safety first, delivered by a seasonal workforce. So safety is the first value and the first risk category. The people delivering it are the ones we looked at in component E. There were 300 seasonal workers, most of them 18 to 25, 1 or 2 days of training. So the fair side is because there is one, and it was something that I made a note of. So operators get more training and pass tests while supervisors are experienced operators. So the control center will watch every ride. The license is reissued every year after inspection. And the industry says a serious injury on a ride is extremely unlikely. Whilst the other side is a lot of the frontline safety work is done by people on 4 to 8 month contracts. The 2 numbers that would settle it is how many come back and how many operators are actual seasonal, and that information isn't given. But what keeps this one open is quite simple, and that is that the seasonal model is what makes a March to October seasonal affordable. So the same model puts the newest staff closest to the safety critical job, whilst the pre-scene gives you the controls. It doesn't actually give you the outcomes which are measured, and the outcome measures is the one industry KPI that isn't reported in here. Then finally we have tension 6. So this is heritage against where the growth is. So the last one which I picked up is the mission and the vision, which we looked at earlier in component E, turned into a strategic question. On one side, a national legend is the one thing a competitor cannot buy. A global franchise can be licensed by anyone with the money, and licenses do expire. So Hasper has been built around one story for 15 years, and the document says international visitors come to Dealand partially for its history and traditions. On that reading, Hasper World holds the one advantage which can't be replicated by its rivals. Whereas on the other side, it says that the market's growth is coming from global brands, technology, and destination stays. The vision claims that world leadership for entertainment and fun, but it doesn't mention teaching anyone anything. So the youngest visitors grew up on franchise theming. So the real question that appears to me is how far can the business change what it offers before it stops being the thing that people want to visit? Now the pre-scene will give you evidence for both answers, but a verdict is going to be up to you, I suspect. Next, we have the stakeholder map, and that's component I. So here we have 9 stakeholders with where their power comes from and what they want. So it's going to be very important to familiarize yourself with this. So the 2 rows that I draw your attention to is the family members outside the business. We have 30% of the equity, 1 meeting a year, and the performance concern already on the record, and the industry body, which is the OAPO, which it sets every ride standard and it reissues the operating license every year. So that's a different kind of power from any customer or shareholder. It's whether the park actually opens, which makes them pretty powerful. So below the table, what I've actually done here is I've written out where these collide. The clearest example is inside the family. So we have 30% with a concern and no seat, facing 60% with every seat, then succession, which nobody has actually addressed for a chair over 80. Then we have the OAPO's annual renewal on a timetable that the business doesn't actually control. And one thing about the visitors, we have 53% of them say that sustainability shapes their choices, and the pre-scene attributes that to young adults under the age of 30. So the segmentation chart puts 20 to 29-year-olds at 29% of the theme park visitors, which is not teenagers. So don't fold the teenagers in to make that look bigger. Next, we have the risks, which are visible from the pre-scene. So that's component J, which is an exposure rather than trade-offs, and I've kept it to the ones that tensions haven't already covered. So the control center, so there's one room which manages the hardware and software of every ride and carries the incident and weather communications. The pre-scene calls it critical and describes no backup, no second sight, no mitigation of any kind, but it doesn't say there isn't one, but none is actually disclosed. Then we have the cyber exposure, which was the report which names failures of the website or app as something that could stop them operating. So if we read that against the tickets section, most visitors come in on pre-booked tickets scanned at the gate. So the booking system is the front door, and the report puts sabotage of a ride, physical or cyber, inside that same safety category. Then we have some more. 4 more actually. So one site in one country carrying every visitor and every license. The weather, which closes the big rides for 4 months and could close them for longer. A sustainability value with no program or target disclosed behind it. And 2 founders over 80 with no arrangement for their board roles or their shares. So every one of them is anchored to a fact in the pre-scene, but none of them is actually a prediction. Right. The anchor points which I picked out. So what we have here is a component K, and I want to be quite clear about it. So 8 areas where the document has done unusual amount of work. So we have ownership, which is the hotel question that the KPI set. We have technology, safety, and the seasonal workforce. Then we have sustainability, the visitor base, and the control center. So that's a map of where the case built things, but it's not a list of what will be asked specifically. But the pre-scene doesn't really signal the tasks, and I've got no idea what they're going to be. So we need to be careful here not to try to predict them, just to be ready to to handle them in the best way we can do. So anyone who tells you that they can predict it is guessing. So the wording on each is to try to be ready to think about. So what we want to do is try and train a way of thinking. So if this comes up, it's a prediction, and I'm not one for making them. So what we're going to try and do is just be ready for all of the possibilities that might be potentially there for us and learn how to handle them each of the way. So if we look at the method and how we're actually going to make this pre-scene ours, this is my interpretation of the analysis, but of course it's important for you to do it. So try to name a fact where a fact came from before it's actually been used. Then we have our so what. So we want to train ourselves to say what the fact forces in a way that the fact alone doesn't do that. So we need to have an element of discipline here. So if we have an interference which could run past the evidence, then try to apply that in the same sentence. So through this analysis, you might have noticed that there's no SWOT, there's no pestle, there's no value chains, there's no stakeholder grid of axes. And I've done that deliberately because those, in my opinion, are actually exam day tools. And you pick one after you've read what the tasks and the exhibit actually want to. But what this page is actually designed to do is to try and give you the ammunition for when a task does ask for something, the facts that that model would need are essentially in your head. So that for me is the bit that matters most. So when you're looking at this pre-scene, don't just read it, just try and rebuild it yourself, taking into consideration of what I think in your interpretation. So what I would recommend is implying a two-pass method. So try to read the pre-scene through and write the descriptive picture, labeling it up and anchoring it as you do, and then build those tensions yourself, and then compare yours with what I have. And then if you've missed something, try to work out where that gap is, which could potentially be where your learning may be. So once you've done that, stop, which could be, I don't know, maybe a few days. And then the rest of the time should essentially go on trying to write answers to specific questions on this pre-scene. All right, so hopefully that was useful. That's my take and my analysis on the pre-scene of Hasper World. So again, this analysis is completely free. I'll put the link to you underneath the video. Feel free to have a look at it and make some notes on it yourself. Ask A anything you like if you have any questions there. So just to raise a point again, just reading analysis isn't going to teach you how to write a specific SBL answer, because that's a whole completely different skill, and it's obviously the one that's going to be examined. So what I've done so far is, and I'll keep building here, is I've actually put two tasks on already, which is on Exhibit A here. I've written them on the pre-scene and the case, and as I said, over the next fortnight up to the exam, I'll try and put as many one as I can do. You can have a look at as many as you like. It will mark it up, it will give you some feedback there if you do want to do some practice, and it's going to essentially be coached down to the sentence, and it's going to try to explain to you where your answers stop scoring in terms of leaving those marks on the table. What I'm going to try and do is I'll try to go through a number of them on this channel, and I'll also try and build a free mock for us as well to sit there. So again, just to mention that Exhibit A is independent and it's not affiliated with ACCA. It's something that I built with all of my notes, all of my tacit knowledge over the years. So if you did spot something in the pre-scene that I didn't, then feel free to mention it, as I'll be covering them. So all right, thanks for watching the video. Hopefully that was really useful, and if I don't see you between now and the exam, best of luck, and God bless.